like to introduce you this morning to our speaker, Carol McKinley, who is my colleague. She is, the Reverend Carol McKinley is an Olympia resident since 1970. She received her Master in Divinity from Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry in 2004, so we're fellow alumna. She served for more than 7 years as the coordinator of Washington Unitarian Universalist Voices for Justice, a statewide legislative advocacy network that still addresses social, economic, and environmental justice issues that come before the Washington legislature. She is affiliated as a community minister with the Olympia UU congregation, our neighbor just to the south. A native of Spokane, Washington, she received her bachelor's in English literature and writing from the University of Washington. She has taught English in secondary schools and community colleges. She owned an Olympia out-of-print bookstore and was an executive editor of A.B. Bookman's Weekly, the international magazine of the antiquarian book trade. Prior to attending seminary, she was the indexer of the Washington State Code Revisor's Office. We are very lucky. I'm so delighted to introduce to you Carol McKinley.
I always like to say I have kind of a checkered career in the different work that I've done. My first reading is from a book of meditations by the Reverend David Blanchard. And he writes, "There may be several possible answers to why the Unitarian Universalist might cross the road. Among them, because that's where they were serving coffee, or they didn't cross it, they transcended it, or that they only go as far as the middle of the road since they didn't want to take sides. The fact is, we cross the road for the same reason the chicken did, to get to the other side. Now, getting to the other side isn't always simple. People we love die. We grow and change in unexpected ways, and we make mistakes and hurt people we care about, and vice versa. We can find ourselves more alone at times than we can bear. And yet there are times when we are overwhelmed by the beauty of this world, or by the blessing of unexpected kindness. Getting to the other side is easier when we choose to travel with others. Life in community isn't always easy, but it's the only place we can practice being human. Finding our way to the other side is less treacherous when we listen and learn from those who have made the trip before and who know something about the route. Jesus, Buddha, Zoroaster, Rumi, Starhawk, Thoreau, Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X, or Harvey Milk. Teachers whose living was and remains a testament to the sacred dimensions of being human. And we reach the other side with fewer regrets and with less baggage if we have found a way to accept each other for who we are, even as we seek to be what we might become. In community, we are reminded of our ideals, yet it is also a place to confess our limitations and express our deepest hope. Liberal religion is not an easy street, but what we have to offer is this: a tradition that affirms human dignity, that encourages spiritual growth and discovery, and that is intellectually honest in the face of the complexities of our time. We offer these tools and our companionship so that we might help each other get safely from here to the other side. The second reading is a unison reading that's in your grade hymnal. It's number 580. It's by the Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, called The Task of the Religious Community. Let's read this in unison. Okay. The central task of the religious community is to unveil the bonds that bend each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the church that assures us we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The religious community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength too limited to do all that must be done. Together our vision widens, and our strength is renewed. Just a few months ago, former President Jimmy Carter issued a statement, and his statement read, "I have been a practicing Christian all my life and a deacon and a Bible teacher for many years. My faith is a source of strength and comfort to me, as religious beliefs are to hundreds of millions of people around the world. So my decision," said President Carter, "my decision to sever my ties with the Southern Baptist Convention after 6 decades was painful and difficult. It was, however, an unavoidable decision when the convention's leaders, quoting a few carefully selected Bible passages and claiming that Eve was created second to Adam and was responsible for original sin, ordained that women must be subservient to their husbands and prohibited from serving as deacons, pastors, or chaplains in the military service." Now, President Carter emphasizes in his statement that the denial of full equality to women is not limited to Southern Baptists or to any one belief. He recognizes that higher authority has been used across the century and in many cultures to deny women and others equal rights. But his own church leader's pronouncement, which Carter called a twisted interpretation of the Word of God, was more than his own conscience and sense of justice could bear, and he could no longer be part of that denomination. Now, when I read that statement by President Carter, I was deeply moved by his words and his act, because I can understand how painful it must have been for this deeply religious man to leave his lifelong tradition. But to him, it was more important to act against the church hierarchy's blatant discrimination against women using those carefully selected Bible passages. Well, Jimmy Carter's act put him in good company. Good company that includes that small group that stepped off the English ship Mayflower onto the shores of this country in 1620. Now, just 10 years later, by 1630, that band had grown to 20,000 settlers in what is now New England. And like President Carter, many of those colonists had left their home in England to escape the repressive ecclesiastical structures and those strictures that had governed their religious lives. Some of those people had suffered persecution and chose to leave not only their country, that chose to leave their traditional church as well. And in this new land, those devout Christians wanted to have churches, but they were leery of creating churches like those that they had left. Ones that they felt were founded in the name of Christianity, but from their point of view, served primarily the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So those settlers wanted a new kind of church, a church that served the people. But what would such a church look like? After all, they didn't have a pattern for that from their own backgrounds. How could a new kind of religious community be created? Now, for any of us who are involved in church life, it meant, what else? Having lots of meetings. So first they had meetings to exchange some ideas, and then more meetings to come to an agreement about what kind of church they wanted, and then some more meetings about how it then would be run. Now, fortunately, someone took notes at those meetings back in the 1600s, so we can look back on how our Unitarian and Universalist polity, the form of our governance, our tradition's governance, was shaped. And I know you've heard about the Dedham Church earlier from Carmen, but I'm going to mention again that church because that was such a landmark event in the history of the traditional and the new free church in America. And thanks to the work of our ministerial colleague, the Reverend Alice Blair Wesley, who lives in Bellevue part of the year, and is now retired from active ministry, but is a scholar widely known for her expertise on the history and theology of the covenantal church. Our understanding through Alice has been enriched of those years and how our church was established. Now she writes that people attending those early meetings there in New England were highly sociable and highly literate people. They were people of all economic classes, and though largely of the new and rising middle class. And among them were many university professors, many university-educated preachers, and many tens of thousands of lay people. These people were called by others the English Puritans. However, they themselves hated that name, and they themselves did not use it. They just called themselves Christians or Congregationalists. Now, over time, some of those Congregationalists became Unitarians, while others became Congregationalists with a capital C, which is now the United Church of Christ, or the UCC. Now, having been persecuted by their English churches for their non-traditional ideas, the colonists knew they wanted to be in fellowship with earnest, humble, and sincere seekers of truth, those who put the bonds of human brotherhood and sisterhood above that of creed. In other words, they did not believe that allegiance to particular beliefs etched in stone in a church creed should be a condition of their membership in the church. So, as many of us know, because we might have come from creedal traditions, creeds can present a problem. Because no matter how carefully we try to list the most important truths in our creed, we find many words on the list that can be challenged. What do you mean by equity, or compassion, or salvation? What do you mean by the word God? What do you mean even by church or covenant? Human beings are going to disagree on meaning, intent, and definitions. Some may even want to reject the language used by the church they have left and not use that religious language at all. But what if they did not believe in the same way? Then what will actually hold them together as a religious body? Well, one thing those religious ancestors of ours did agree upon was the value of experience. And they wrote, we know, we experience God as a spirit of mutual love. We know, we experience God as a spirit of mutual love. And that alone is worthy of our utmost loyalty. In other words, they agreed that an understanding of what religious love requires of us does not flow down from archbishops to bishops to parish ministers to the flocks in the pews. That understanding comes from within each one of us. A few centuries later, the professor James Luther Adams paraphrased that doctrine. He said, "You can't make the Holy Spirit work according to an organization chart." But then, how did those ancestors of ours make their concept of a new church an actual reality? Again, we can thank Alice Blair Wesley for her sleuthing in this area. She studied the records of all of those early meetings and began studying and figuring out how they put the church together. The record of the Dedham, Massachusetts village meeting in 1637 indicates they convened, as she said, lovingly to discourse and consult together and prepare for spiritual communion in a church society. Alice observes, for anyone who might suppose that our 17th century free church ancestors talked mostly about original sin or predestination or hellfire, I'm glad to tell you, she says, not one of those topics is mentioned in the record of the founding of the Dedham Church. Those documents record the talk they engaged in at each step on their way to the founding. Alice adds an aside. You have to love that talk business. There seems to be a historical precedent for our being a bunch of blabbermouths. So Alice continues, in those pages there is much use of the word reason, reasoning. There is also repeated use of the words sweet, comfort, help, and brotherly. But by far the most commonly used words in that written history are affection, embrace, love, loving, and lovingly. She says, in the first 24 pages, I counted 32 uses of the words affection and love. Why? Because then and now, and for as long as human history lasts, when all is said and done, the integrity of the free church comes down to our loyalty to the spirit of love at work in the hearts and minds of its local members. But what is the free church? What is freedom? Well, for the good people gathered in Dedham, Massachusetts, it meant freedom to be governed not by those creeds they had rejected or pronouncements dictated by church hierarchy, but by the spirit of love. Together, the people of Dedham created a covenant, a promise that they saying how they would be together as a community. The words they used were not unlike the words we used in the chalice lighting for this morning's service. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humanity in fellowship, to the end that all souls grow together in harmony with the divine. Thus do we covenant together. So that first covenant, those first covenants that were created in other churches as well, said it very simply. Love is the doctrine of this church. Love, working in the minds and spirits and hearts of the people gathered together in worship and fellowship. The covenant, that promise, was how they put into words the meaning of their membership in their church. Well, what is this spirit of love that we often talk about? It's not really love as a sentiment, the kind of sentiment we recognize on Valentine's Day, although we certainly celebrate that kind of love as well. And it's not a sweeping love that says we love each person equally or in the same way, although we would hope that everyone practices respect and mutual concern for one another. Love is the doctrine of this church does mean we have a bond in this liberal religious community, that we work together to live out the principles and values of our tradition, values of peace, freedom, and equality. A church is created by souls coming together to discover and share what that kind of love requires. Now, of course, our promises, our covenants, do not ensure smooth sailing forever and ever. And it doesn't guarantee that all will be peaceful in our communities. I'm sure the people of Dedham had lots of conflicts. People who did not share their religious ideas, for example, if they were Roman Catholics, those people were not welcome in their churches. Women who preached were punished and expelled because it was against the law for women to speak authoritatively in that society. Some of those people in that community might even have been accused of witchcraft and tried. Now, a covenant does not make our problems or conflicts disappear. We can almost guarantee at any time we are with at least one other person, disagreements will happen. Now, nearly 15 years ago, a conflict in my home congregation in Olympia led to the sudden departure of the minister and bitter arguments among our members. Some left our church and started a second UU community, which is now the All Souls congregation, which is in Lacey. Now, following that conflict, a long process of healing and rebuilding trust under the leadership of an interim minister began before our settled minister was called. Now, it took more than a year of talk and collaboration to bring us to the place where we could create a new congregational covenant. And that document, which is in our Sunday order of service, on our webpage, and which we say together regularly throughout the year, affirms our commitment to our congregation. And it names the ways we hope that this covenant will be reflected in our relationships together and in our activities in the larger world. And of course, our new covenant did not make conflict disappear, but it did remind us that we promised to address differences among us in the spirit of love and fellowship. We know from our own experience as church members and as human beings, we know from our own experience that living in covenant is not easy. It requires faith in oneself, faith in others, and in the greater good of the community.